everyone, this is Phil Travis, and it is week 7 here at EOU. This is History 458, the American Civil War and Reconstruction. This week, our discussion, which I've tried to make a little more brief, this week our discussion is going to be dealing with the year 1863, which is the year we're dealing with this year. 1863 was an important turning point in the American Civil War. We'll be looking at particularly things like the Emancipation Proclamation. We'll be looking at the Battle of Vicksburg and also the Battle of Gettysburg. Vicksburg and Gettysburg together, really from a military standpoint, in a strategic standpoint, really result in the turning point of the American Civil War. With the success of Ulysses S. Grant's armies against the Confederate armies at Vicksburg on the Mississippi, the Union effectively gained complete control of the Mississippi River, and in this sense really began to solidify its blockade of the Confederate States of America. And with the defeat of Robert E. Lee's army in Gettysburg, following an invasion into southern Pennsylvania, the defeat of Robert E. Lee's army really is the end of any sort of active, offensive sort of campaigns that the Confederate army in Virginia is able to take for the rest of the war. After these battles, after the turning point in 1863, it's really a slow defeat for the Confederate States. Of course, in the earlier years, in 61 and 62, and in much of the beginning of 63, the Confederate States had won some really impressive and stellar victories, highly costly, but nonetheless highly impressive and stellar victories. The Union seemingly up to Gettysburg, when it came to fighting, at least in the area of Virginia and Maryland, in that general area, it seemed like the Union just couldn't really win a battle almost, at least not a major one. And so as a result of that, the Confederacy was very successful early on, but the Confederacy could not win a long, drawn-out war of attrition against the Union. They didn't possess the industrial capacity. They didn't possess the naval capacity. They just did not have the numbers, population-wise. They didn't have the numbers, resource-wise, to be able to win a long-term, multi-year war of attrition. Their goal, as we had always been talking about, was to really win major stellar victories, particularly near the Union capital, and use these victories to gain international recognition from a country like Great Britain, and to ultimately convince the Union that it was worth too much blood and too much treasure to try to defeat the Confederacy and to get Abraham Lincoln to agree to a treaty that would recognize the Confederate States of America as an independent sovereign state. With the failure at Gettysburg of Robert E. Lee's armies against the forces led by General George Meade, where we see Robert E. Lee make some really significant errors with things like Pickett's charge, and of course his misjudgment of the positioning of George Meade's artillery. Robert E. Lee is handed ultimately a crushing defeat, though the Union and the Confederacy both suffered greatly at the battle. It ends the capabilities of the South to wage the types of battles that it thought were necessary to convince the Union to agree to acknowledge it as a sovereign state. And after 1863, it really becomes a crushing grinding down of the Confederate States of America by the Union, as the Union, in its pursuit of victory, really had to defeat the South. It had to crush the rebellion to such an extent that the South would effectively surrender. And ultimately, in achieving that aim, the Union would eventually adopt a strategy of total war in much of the South, enacting a really crushing blockade on the South, which of course began at the beginning of the war, but after 1863, it's much more thoroughly implemented, especially after control of the Mississippi is gained. The Union, of course, with Sherman's March to the Sea, is probably the most preeminent example of the use of total war in the South. Total war meaning that you're not simply targeting the military and things that directly support the military. You're also, to a large degree, targeting the civilian population and trying to, break the civilian population's will to make war. The use of total war in things like Sherman's March to the Sea is really the first case in modern history where total war has been employed against an enemy. And of course, during World War II, you'll see all sides really employ, the sort of strategic, and tactical measures of total war. And if anybody's interested in reading about that with World War II, I recommend a book called Annihilation by Thomas Zeller to talk about talks about the legacy of the use of the tactic of total war to achieve the strategic objective of really complete victory. This week, our reading, McPherson, Battle Cry of Freedom, chapter 16 and 21. We'll be looking at, what I've already mentioned, emancipation, Gettysburg, Vicksburg, and so forth. This week, we also have a book review to write. The book review is 500 to 600 words. No more than 600 words, no less than 500 words. And I'm going to be really rigid about that. And the reason is because if you ever go on to become a historian, one of the things that we do is we write book reviews. And if they ask for a book review that's 700 words, then you have to give them a book review that is no larger than 700 words. If you give them something longer, they will reject it or tell you to write it again. And so you really, with a book review, you really have to be within the parameters of what they're asking for. If you ever go to graduate school for history, you're going to write a lot of book reviews. So this is a good practice in being able to read a book. The review, of course, is of Drew Gilpin Faust's This Republic of Suffering. It's not that long a book, so we should be able to read the entire book this week and submit the review on Sunday. And then next week, after we've all submitted our reviews, we'll be discussing the book in the discussion forum. But you should be able to read the book, and you should try to get a feeling for what the argument is, why the argument's significant, how is the argument made, what is the trajectory of the book. Give the reader a kind of feeling of the book, its argument, its significance, its length, its organization, what types of research. And if you have a criticism, you can make one or two really nice criticisms. Generally, book reviews really, though you do get this. I've experienced reviews of my own work, my own book, where I've had a reviewer who I think wrote a review that was not very nice. And you can make criticisms, but you shouldn't obsess over your criticisms. Everybody can criticize any book. And so if you want to make a criticism, that's fine. Just make the criticism briefly. Usually you would put the criticism at the end. The goal is to explain what the book's about, what's its contribution, how's it organized. And then if you have a little criticism, you can make that at the end, but you shouldn't obsess over it. Anytime you're reviewing a book, you want to always remember that writing a book is hard, that it takes, it takes a couple of years to write a book. You conduct research all over the place to write a book. It's a real labor. It takes a lot of work. And so in that respect, when you review a book, you always want to come off as respectful of the scholar that you're reviewing. Not all reviewers of books are like that. Everyone who's ever written a book has probably experienced a reviewer who seem to be unnecessarily mean, if you will. But most generally, historians, should be, an objective sort of reviewer and should not be looking to be overly negative or overly positive, but rather to review the book and give the reader a feeling of what the book's about, what its contribution is, what its audience is, how is it argued. And you can make a couple little criticisms in there, but don't obsess over those. I have a sample book review in modules for you, so you can see that review. I also have a guide list, like a checklist for the book review, so you can go in there and make sure that you are following the directions for the book review very clearly. See that before you write the review, because there's some important little elements in there. All right, that's it. Here's your factoid. I know I go longer and longer with these, don't I? Here's the factoid. The factoid is this. The Civil War, for many women, provided an opportunity to sort of try to challenge the forces of gender control, of gender repression. In American society, at this time, very, very few women would have worked outside of the home. The only women that would have worked outside of the home would have been working class women and maybe young single women. But increasingly, gender was constructed in society that ideally a woman's place was in the home, raising kids and taking care of the husband and the family. And the man's place was in the public sphere. And of course, this is a construct, right? Gender is a construct. Societies construct, what the different roles of genders are and what gender means in society. And so at this time period, women had their freedom greatly, constrained because of social constructs of gender. But during the Civil War, this certainly encouraged a number of women to sort of break the bounds of gender repression, of this social construct. And a great example of this is Clara Barton. Clara Barton was ultimately the founder of the Red Cross. She was a self-taught nurse who worked in the hospitals during the American Civil War. And Clara Barton, like many women during this time period, were initially looked down upon. They were considered to be unfit to be doctors, that doctors in this type of role was a male's job. But during the Civil War, a number of women on both sides of the war, employed their skills in the nursing profession, and in this respect really challenged the sort of preconceived notions of gender inequality by demonstrating their vital contribution to things like sanitary conditions and to medical assistance in the war. And so Clara Barton, founder of the Red Cross, a self-taught nurse, was an example of a woman who really challenged the bounds of gender inequality and used her skills to advance the medical and life-saving efforts during the American Civil War. All right, guys, let's have a great week. Email me if you have any questions, and I will see you in the discussion forum.